Yine bu sahnede birbirinden değerli konukları ağırlayacağız. İşte onlardan bir tanesi, ben bu kitapla geldim. Şöyle size de göstereyim. Ulusların Düşüşü kitabı. Daron Acemoğlu ve James Robinson'ın kitabı. Bu kitap hakkında bahsedeceğim sizlere ve James Robinson hakkında birkaç kelam etmek isterim. Profesör James Robinson siyaset bilimci ve ekonomist, halen Chicago Üniversitesi Harris School Public Policy'de görevini sürdürüyor. Yayımlandıktan sonra kısa sürede ses getiren Ulusların Düşüşü, Güç, Zenginlik ve Yoksulluğun Kökenleri isimli kitabını Profesör Daron Acemoğlu'yla beraber kaleme aldı. Kitap, neden dünyada bazı ülkeler zenginken bazıları yoksuldur sorusunun cevabına yenilikçi bir bakış açısıyla düşünmemizi sağlıyor. Ayrıca şunu da hatırlatayım efendim, Sayın James Robinson'ın sunumu bittikten sonra ana salondan çıkıyoruz. Hezarfen salonunda bu kitabın imza etkinliği olacak. Bunu zaten tekrar hatırlatacağım sizlere. Şimdi alkışlarınızla Profesör James Robinson'ı sunumlarını yapmak üzere sahneye davet ediyorum. Buyurun efendim. Welcome.
Okay, where are we? I can see this. Everybody else can see this? Ah, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's very exciting to be here. Such a interesting and dynamic event. I'm still not quite sure why you invited me and not Professor Acemoglu, since he's Turkish and we're in Turkey. But I think probably you must be very bored with him by now, right? I mean, you must be bored with him. You want to see who's the other person. Okay, so I'm the other person, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that Daron and I wrote, Why Nations Fail. We're writing another book at the moment, so when we finish that, you'll be able to invite him to talk about that. So what's this book? What's this book about? If I had one slide to show you what this book is about, which sort of explains more or less all the ideas in it, as we'll see as my talk goes on, it would be this. Okay, so this is the Korean peninsula at night. What can you see? Well, you can see here's the demilitarized zone in between North Korea and South Korea. You can see in South Korea there's a lot of electricity and lights. Here's Seoul. You can see there's motorways with lights and towns. And North Korea is completely black. There's a little bit of light here. Maybe that's the presidential compound in Pyongyang. But you can see that North Korea has very little electricity or light bulbs. Okay? That's a very basic, well, they could have electricity and no light bulbs, or light bulbs but no electricity, but it seems likely that they have neither electricity nor light bulbs. Now, that's a pretty basic technology, electricity. It's not a very new technology. It's been around since the 19th century, but it's absolutely basic for having a modern economy and a prosperous society. Okay? This difference in electricity represents enormous differences in living standards. It represents enormous differences in the well-being of the citizens of South Korea and North Korea, in their life expectancy and their health. But it's an interesting distinction, isn't it? Because Korea was unified historically. It's a country with a long history of centralized authority, a common language, a common culture. It was split apart in the 1940s into two very different societies, organized, and that's going to be the theme of my talk, organized in very different ways. Of course, you can think of all sorts of explanations for why South Korea uses more advanced modern technology and North Korea doesn't. But the explanation we advance in the book is that it's just due to the way that these two different societies got organized. And the way that social scientists talk about that is this word called institutions. The institutions in South Korea, the rules which create patterns of incentives and opportunities in society, the institutions in South Korea are very different from the institutions in North Korea. The institutions in North Korea don't create economic incentives, don't create economic opportunities, and the result of that is poverty and the lack of modern technology. In South Korea, the economic institutions do create incentives and opportunities, and that's why you have modern technology, and that's why South Korea is much more prosperous than North Korea. So this is not a book about the difference between capitalism and socialism, as you'll see. You might look at that and you say, well, North Korea is socialist. We know that socialism doesn't work, and South Korea is capitalist, and that's not going to be the point. By the end of my talk, you're going to see that actually North Korea has many things in common with every poor country in the world. Many countries which are totally unrelated to socialism, but they have many of the same problems of North Korea. And South Korea, similarly, has many of the same things that all prosperous countries have. So it's not about socialism and capitalism. In fact, I'm going to develop a different language. We develop a different language in the book to talk about these differences, which encompasses the difference between capitalist and socialist societies. So the economic differences are obvious. Everyone here understands that this is to do with the way the economy is organized in South Korea compared to North Korea. And the other thing about this example which is interesting is it's also obvious to everybody in the room where that came from. Okay? This comes from politics. Okay? It's the politics which created these very different institutional structures in North Korea and South Korea, which created prosperity in South Korea and poverty in North Korea. So let me tell you a little bit about economic growth and why electricity is so important, and what do economists know about what generates economic growth. Okay? So, and I'll do that in a very personalized way. I'll show you a census. This is a census file from the 1851 English census. Down here, in the last cell, we have the Coker family. Henry Coker. He was aged 32 in 1851, and he was a fisherman. And he was living in a place called B Sands, down in Devon here. So who was Henry Coker? Well, he was my mother's great-great-grandfather. He had a son who was also called Henry. He was 9 years old in 1851. But when he grew up, he migrated north. He went and he got a job in South Bank. It was the Industrial Revolution. He got a job in the Smiths Iron Works, okay? Industrialization. What was happening in England in the 19th century? Fishermen were moving north. They were taking jobs in factories. The economy was industrializing. It was using new technology, and people who were doing more or less nothing, like fishermen, moved to factories. What's this? This is a photograph I took recently in Leyte. It's in the south of the Philippines, where I've been doing some research. This is what an underdeveloped country looks like. There's 17 people waiting to carry my bag. I don't know if airports... I checked in the airport in Istanbul last night. It seems much more efficient than this. There's a lot of underemployed people in poor countries sitting around doing nothing. You could take 16 of those people and put them in a factory, and you'd enormously increase productivity of the society. So that's what was happening in the 19th century when my mother's great-grandfather moved up to Middlesbrough. Okay? So here you have industry, you had an iron works, you had modern technology, you had steam engines. Okay? So since the work of Robert Solow in the 1950s, economists have understood that what drives economic development, what makes a society prosperous, is innovation. I was very excited this morning during the speeches, the first speeches today, to hear everybody talking about innovation. Innovation, innovation, new instruments, new financial instruments. This is the steam engine. This is the steam engine that James Watt perfected in the 18th century. This is one of the kind of pinnacles of the Industrial Revolution, James Watt invented this thing down here called the separate condenser. He made the steam engine much more efficient. He enormously increased the amount of inanimate power available to work in factories. The Industrial Revolution was all about innovation, new technologies, mechanization of production, new mechanisms of power, new systems of transportation, the railroad. It was about innovation, okay? So innovation was crucial. Innovation increases human productivity, okay? Like electricity or light bulbs, okay? So we know that's what drives technological change. It drives enormous differences in living standards over time, and it drives differences in living standards across countries. Of course, there's lots of other investment you have to do apart from investment in new technology, like the steam engine. This is Saltburn Grammar School. My mother was the first person in her extended family ever to finish secondary school. This is where she went to secondary school, and she even went to teacher training college after that. Okay? So this is investment in education, in human capital. We know what creates prosperity. It's innovation, it's new ideas, new ways of doing things, new financial instruments, new capital markets, new institutions, organizations, investment in education, human capital, improving the skills and education level of the workforce. So the puzzle is, why is it that some societies invest in technology, innovate? Why do they invest in education in their children, build schools, build universities, higher education institutions? And other societies don't do that. And that's the sort of economics of our book. I'm just, through the lens of my mother's family history. Now, here's another difference. I talked about the difference between North Korea and South Korea, and I'll come back to that. Here's another difference. It's a fence, and on the right-hand side is the United States. It's the city of Nogales. It's the United States on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, it's Mexico. Now, you can notice here there's a fence. I don't know if President Trump has actually been here, but there's already a wall in Nogales. So maybe he wants to build a bigger and kind of fancier wall, but there's been a wall here for quite a long time in Nogales. And this is another interesting example, like the South Korean example, which sort of focuses attention on what the real difference is. Okay? You can't explain the difference between North Korea and South Korea by some difference in culture or geography or resource endowment. That's all very, very, very, very, very similar. And in fact, the levels of prosperity were similar 60 or 70 years ago. And then you had this dramatic divergence when these societies got organized in different ways. And the same is true of the United States and Mexico. There's no big cultural or geographical, no big fundamental difference between Nogales on two sides of the fence. It's just that institutions in the United States are very different from institutions in Mexico on the other side of the fence. And to illustrate what I have in mind here, let me give you an example not of two cities or two countries, but of two people. So in some sense, if you want to understand what's the difference between the United States and Latin American countries, why is it that over the last 200 years the United States has been so much more innovative, technologically more prosperous than Latin American countries? Think about the two richest men in the world. The two richest men in the world are, people's fortunes go up and down, but usually it's Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, and Carlos Slim. And ask yourself, how did those men make their money? Bill Gates was an innovator, okay? He started Microsoft, DOS, operating system, software. He innovated. He was a very early innovator in the computer industry. So he pulled enormous amount of resources and talent into the computer industry, okay? That's doing something which is very desirable for Bill Gates. He got very rich, but also for society. It creates an enormous amount of prosperity for society. Carlos Slim, on the other hand, again, a very intelligent, capable, talented entrepreneur, was in a very different institutional environment. The way to make money in Mexico is not to innovate, it's to create monopolies. He made a fortune through his telecom monopoly, which was privatized by the government to him. The OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, made a calculation that between 2005 and 2009, Carlos Slim's monopolies reduced Mexican GDP by $128 billion. Okay? That's a very conservative calculation of the costs, the deadweight losses from monopoly. What's interesting about that number is that that's much larger than his personal fortune. So the monopolies that Carlos Slim has in Mexico are not just about taking income from ordinary Mexicans and giving it to Carlos Slim. They're actually reducing national income at the same time. This is not a story about good guy, bad guy, or Anglo-Saxon culture, or no. They're just both very talented, very clever entrepreneurs. But they're functioning in very different institutional environments with very different incentives, very different opportunities for making wealth. What do I mean by that? Here's Bill Gates. Bill Gates wanted to be a monopolist too. Here he is in front of US antitrust authorities in Washington, D.C., swearing to tell the whole truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He wanted to be a monopolist too, just like Carlos Slim. The thing is, in the United States, it's just more difficult to be a monopolist. Okay? So we can discuss how effective the antitrust suit against Bill Gates was, but I think this is a remarkable scene. It's the scene of the richest, one of the most powerful men in the United States being dragged in front of antitrust authorities in Washington and being found guilty of collusive practices. This is a very old thing in the United States. In fact, if you go back over 100 years, I'll show you a picture of an octopus. Okay, it's an octopus. If you look at the octopus's head, it says Standard Oil. You see, Standard Oil. This is the octopus of the Standard Oil Company. This was a monopoly of the Rockefellers. You can see the Standard Oil Company. They started off in petroleum. It has its tentacles around the White House, around the Capitol. The Standard Oil Company was heavily involved in political corruption. In fact, the activities of the Standard Oil Company and other companies like it, the so-called robber barons, were one of the things that led to the creation of antitrust authorities in the United States, starting in the 1870s and the 1880s. This is a contemporary cartoon. And what happened to the Standard Oil Company? The Standard Oil Company was broken up by antitrust authorities early in the last century. Okay? So antitrust, which came after Bill Gates, goes way back into the 19th century, is an attempt to control and regulate and discipline monopoly. What's important about monopoly? Okay? Well, monopoly creates barriers. It blocks incentives and it blocks opportunities. But if you want to have prosperity, you need incentives and you need opportunities for people. And you don't just need that for a narrow segment of society. You need that for everybody. Okay? So I started talking about the Korea, North Korea, South Korea, Mexico, United States. Let me introduce this terminology we have in the book for the difference between these two societies. It's not capitalist and socialist, all right? It's a way of thinking about this, as I said, of which, socialist societies, for example, are just one type of something else. So what is something else? Well, we make a distinction between two different sorts of economic institutions, sets of rules which create incentives and opportunities in the economic sphere. And we make a distinction in the book between what we call inclusive economic institutions and extractive economic institutions. So what South Korea has is inclusive economic institutions. What North Korea has are extractive economic institutions. And that's the big difference between the United States and Mexico as well. Let me dwell a little on this word inclusive, because this word is very important. Okay? And I'm going to do it with let's go back to light bulbs. I started off by talking about light bulbs. Let's go back to light bulbs. And Thomas Edison, right, one of the great innovators in world history. Here's the patent, January 27, 1880. Edison took out a patent for the light bulb. Okay? Now, a patent is a very interesting thing. Okay? What does a patent do? Patent protects your intellectual property rights. You get an innovation, you have an idea. Other people can borrow that, they can build on it. So it's very difficult for an innovator to benefit from all the wealth that their innovation creates. So the idea of patents to protect your intellectual property rights are to create incentives for innovation, which otherwise might be missing. The patents are a very important thing historically. They're in the US Constitution. The first patent board met in 1790, and it had Thomas Jefferson on it. So Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the United States. So this was somehow so important that they had Thomas Jefferson on the patent board deciding whose innovations got patents. The other thing about patents is that anyone could file a patent and pay the same fee, okay? And the state would enforce your intellectual property rights. I showed you earlier on James Watt's steam engine. I spent a week once in Birmingham, in the middle of England, where James Watt and Matthew Boulton used to build their steam engines. I spent a week going through the archives and their papers, and it's fascinating, the story about patents there. James Watt was in Birmingham making sure that the steam engines got built. Matthew Boulton was in London making sure the government enforced their patents. Okay? They cared a lot about patents because it was absolutely critical for the profitability of their investment and their innovation. So anyone paid the same fee, and the state protected your property rights. Okay? So what's inclusive about that? Well, the thing about innovation is it's about human creativity. Okay? People have ideas, they have projects, they have brainwaves, they're entrepreneurial. You don't know where these people are. In any society, there's immense talent and skill, but you don't know where it is. So you have to create a system of rules, of institutions that allow a society to tap into all that latent talent and creativity and entrepreneurship that's out there. And that's what the patent system did. The patent system was very inclusive in the sense that anybody who had an idea could come, pay the same fee, the state protected their property rights. You didn't have to be friends with Thomas Jefferson. You didn't have to have your cousin on the patent board. Okay? There were rules, and they were very inclusive. And in fact, if you go back to the 19th century and you ask yourself, look at the United States, look at these innovators like Thomas Edison. You know, who were these people? Were they elites? Were they connected? Were they the relatives of the founding fathers? The interesting thing is they come from all over the social spectrum. Okay? Artisans, farmers. A third of people who filed patents had no formal education. Edison himself, I'm not advocating lack of education. Edison himself was homeschooled. James Watt was homeschooled, for that matter, as well. So these were not people, but they were people with immense energy and creativity, like Carlos Slim, like Bill Gates, entrepreneurs, business people. They had ideas, they had a vision, they had passion, but society has to channel that vision and passion in the right way, in ways which are socially desirable. And that's what institutions do. That's what the rules do. Okay? That's what you have in the United States. That's what you haven't had in Mexico. Okay? So patents are very interesting things, and I'm sort of dwelling on this because I think this word inclusive is so important. You know, I work a lot in developing countries. I don't know this part of the world very well. I work a lot in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And when people ask me, you know, what's the biggest problem in an African country, or what's the biggest problem in a Latin American country, there's only one answer to that: wasted talent. There's just wasted talent. There's just enormous wasted talent in any poor country. So here's a way, part of a whole system, but one very specific example of how to use the latent talent in society. Okay, so this is an inclusive institution. Monopolies, I gave the example of monopolies. Think of that as being a sort of canonical example of an extractive institution. So this is crucial for providing incentives and opportunities in the economic sphere to have inclusive institutions. Okay? And I heard a lot about that this morning, which was pretty exciting for me. But why does one society have inclusive institutions and another society have extractive institutions? If inclusive institutions create investment and innovation and prosperity, why wouldn't every society want to have inclusive institutions? And that's where the politics comes back in. So when I started talking about North Korea and South Korea, I said, you know, it's sort of obvious that politics has got something to do with this. And that's true with Mexico and the United States too. When Carlos Slim got his monopoly privatized from the government to him without any regulations over prices or anything else, there was a one-party state in Mexico. There was no democracy, there was no political competition, there was no accountability, there was no transparency. It was also about politics, okay? If you go back to the origins of antitrust, the octopus I showed you, where did that come from, this antitrust? It came from a big change in politics in the United States, okay? So it's obvious that these examples suggest this is something to do with politics. So we have inclusive and extractive economic institutions, but sitting behind that is politics. And we use a similar terminology to talk about the politics. So the emphasis in the book is, yes, economic institutions are critical, but you don't get inclusive economic institutions because you hire the right economists from the University of Chicago. That might help, but it's fundamentally about the politics of the society, okay? And we say, if you want to have inclusive economic institutions, you have to have inclusive political institutions. And the problem in countries like North Korea or Mexico is that they have extractive political institutions. So there's two parts of political institutions, and let me illustrate that in the case of extractive political institutions. Here's the first part. Okay, so here's President Mugabe. He's in the news at the moment. He just fired his vice president last week. This is back 17 years ago. You probably know President Mugabe as a very successful politician, but you probably didn't know he's also a very lucky man, too. Here he is. President Mugabe's name was drawn from thousands of other customers. He won the top prize in a lottery organized by the partly state-owned bank. Okay? So what a guy. You know, I don't know if you have politicians like that in Turkey. We don't have them in England or the United States. So he's not just a successful politician. He wins the lottery too in his spare time. Okay? So I don't think I need to elaborate on what this example is about anymore. This is an example of extractive political institutions. Zimbabwe is not a place with very much accountability or transparency. President Mugabe has been running a sort of de facto one-party state for many years, and he's 93 years old and going strong. I heard him give a speech in the summer. He's quite a remarkable chap. So here's one part of, this is the first part of what we call extractive political institutions, and this is about something very simple. Part of extractive political institutions are about how power is distributed and used in society. So Zimbabwe is a country with a very narrow distribution of political power. There's a ruling party, ZANU-PF, and they control the society. Okay? So part of what you need to have inclusive economic institutions is political power broadly distributed in society, not used to the benefit of a narrow elite like you have in the case of Zimbabwe. That's the first part of extractive and inclusive political institutions. Extractive institutions, political institutions, power is narrowly concentrated. inclusive political institutions, power is much more broadly spread in society. Okay? What's the second part? The second part is to do with the way the state operates. Okay? So I'm going to illustrate this I hope this isn't going to be too curious, but I'm going to show you it's a word cloud, and it's a word cloud I calculated from a 1,000-page book written by academics about the problems with Colombia. So I work a lot in Colombia in South America, and 20 academics were asked to write a book about what was the problem in Colombia. And it illustrates very well the other part of extractive political institutions. So this is just counting the frequency with which different words are used in this 1,000-page book. You can see, a lot of stuff here: democracy, inequality, coca. They have a big drug problem in Colombia. That's probably what everybody knows about Colombia. The state. The guerrilla, of course, they also have a Marxist rebel group. They have 3 or 4 Marxist rebel groups, but the biggest one just signed a peace treaty. But, this is a problem in Colombia. Justice is a problem. But let me dwell a little bit on the word state. Okay? So academics pointed to the state. What about the state? Well, if you analyze the most common words which are used in the same sentence as the word state in this book, you get the following word cloud. The most frequent expression that the academics use to talk about the Colombian state is, it's derrumbe parcial in Spanish. But in English, it's not very nice, the translation, but it's partial collapse. So when Colombian academics talk about the state, they talk about the partial collapse of the state. What else do they talk about? They talk about the differentiated presence. By that they mean the Colombian state is absent from large parts of the country. It does nothing. It provides no security, it provides no infrastructure, it provides no services or public goods. It's just absent. People live without the state. Non-compliance of duties. Legitimate monopoly. The great sociologist of the state, Max Weber, said, "The state is the entity in society that has the legitimate monopoly of violence." The Colombian state has never had the monopoly of violence. Colombia has always been plagued by non-state armed actors, and it is today. Okay? Growth of illegality. Some of this doesn't translate very well, I apologize. Need for reform. Chronic weakness. If you look at just the legitimacy crisis, what's interesting about this is the Colombian academics are saying the real problem in Colombia is the way the state works and the inability or the lack of incentive for the state to undertake the functions that the state is supposed to do, to provide public goods, to raise taxes, to provide order and security, to regulate society. If you made a list in Colombia of the richest people, they'd all be people like Carlos Slim. They made their money through contracting with the government, through monopolies in different sectors of the economy, in cement, soft drinks, rice, transportation, very similar to Mexico. Okay? So this just sort of illustrates the other dimension of extractive political institutions. Weakness of the state. Okay? So we say, what's lying behind extractive institutions in the case of Mexico, say, are these two things. Narrow distribution of political power. Remember, they had a one-party state when they privatized the telecom monopoly. And also, weak capacity of the state. If you follow the news in Mexico today, you know Mexico is also plagued by terrible problems with drug cartels and armed groups all over the country. There's enormous problems of security and enormous problems of regulation and corruption also. So this is the emphasis in the book. The emphasis in the book is prosperity. To have prosperity, you need innovation, you need investment. How do you get that? You need incentives and opportunities. That's created by system of rules, by inclusive institutions. Poverty is created by extractive institutions. It doesn't matter if you're in Mexico or Sierra Leone or Myanmar or North Korea or Colombia. the source of poverty is the same thing. It's extractive economic institutions. Why do those systems of institutions differ so much in the world? Because of political differences. Because countries which have extractive institutions, narrow distribution of political power, weak states, create extractive economic institutions. So the way we think about this is that the prosperity of a society is very desirable for its citizens. But to create prosperity, you have to create a particular set of institutions. And that's not necessarily in the interests of people who exercise political authority. Okay? President Mugabe and his people are doing very well from the way Zimbabwe is organized. And go back to the first picture I showed you. There may not be light in most of North Korea, but there's light in the capital where the ruling party lives. Okay, so when I talk about this usually, the one thing people start thinking about is China. What about China? How does China fit into this? Okay. Partly yes, partly no. If you think about Chinese economic growth since the 1970s, how did that happen? Okay, you go back to the middle of the 1970s, China was a very poor country with very backward technology, with terrible economic institutions, very extractive economic institutions. What started happening in 1978? Deng Xiaoping started moving institutions in a much more inclusive way. That started, first of all, in the rural sector. He started deregulating the price system. He started allowing people to make their own decisions. He let them be residual claimants on their own efforts. There was a huge increase in productivity in the rural sector. They thought, oh, this works. In the 1980s, this moved into the industrial sector. So if you want to think about how Chinese economic growth fits in with this framework, it fits in beautifully from the economic point of view. Okay? Economic growth in China took off because economic institutions were made more inclusive. Here's the problem. The problem is the political institutions. I said to have inclusive economic institutions, you need to have inclusive political institutions. But the rule by the Chinese Communist Party does not count as inclusive political institutions. So what do I say about that? Well, this looks like a kind of idyllic industrial scene, normal industrial scene in China. It's not exactly that, actually. It's what's called a re-education through labor camp. So in China, there's about 350 so-called re-education through labor camps. So without any judicial process whatsoever, you can be sent to one of these camps for 3 years. Nobody knows how many people are in these camps. It could be millions. There's no official announcement of this. There's several NGOs who work on this who estimate the number of people in these camps is probably about 2 million. Okay? So this is not something you'd associate with inclusive political institutions. And you may have also read, if you read the newspapers, in 2020, in 3 years' time, the Chinese government are going to rule out what they call the social credit system. Every Chinese person is going to have a score. It's called the social credit score. And it's going to be a massive system for monitoring people's behavior and penalizing people who are not obedient to the state and rewarding people who are obedient to the state. Okay? So I'm just kind of emphasizing here the non-inclusive nature of the Chinese political system. So how do we reconcile that with what's happened in China since the late 1970s? The way we do that is to say, look, there's many experiences in world history of periods of economic growth without the political institutions that you need to create a prosperous society. But they're never sustained. Okay? A great example would be Argentina before the First World War. At the time of the First World War, Argentina was possibly one of the 4 or 5 richest countries in the world. But Argentina didn't have the political institutions capable of sustaining that economy and that economic expansion. And China doesn't have the political institutions capable of sustaining economic expansion either. I think what world history suggests is you don't get inclusive institutions at the whim of a dictatorship or some autocratic system. You have to have a much more inclusive political system to underpin inclusive economic institutions. So you're still having difficulty with that. Let me give you another example. When I was a student at the London School of Economics back in the early 1980s, we were taught, some of you are as old as me, so you may know this. I don't know what they taught in Turkey back in those days, but in the London School of Economics, they taught that if you wanted to have really successful economic growth, you had to have central planning like the Soviets, okay? Now, young people usually laugh when I tell them that, but here's a page from Paul Samuelson's economics textbook. It's 1961, so Paul Samuelson, one of the great economists of the Nobel Prize-winning economist, one of the great minds of the economics profession. Here's his textbook. Now, what does it show you? It shows, this is the Soviet GDP catching up with US GDP in the year 2000. In 1967, this is the 67 new edition of a textbook, same thing. In the year 2000, the Soviet Union was catching up. 1970, Soviet Union wasn't looking so good in 1970. It was delayed until 2010. Now, if I kept going on this, you find that Soviet Union was catching up in 2020, and then it was catching up in 2025, and then the diagram disappeared from the book. Okay? So I think this example is really interesting. There's many, many things that are different between China and the Soviet Union. So I'm not. This is the Soviet Union. The organization of the economy was very different, but I think this example is interesting because the Soviet Union did grow very rapidly. It grew very rapidly from the late 1920s through until the early 1970s. And in fact, it looked like, at the time, one of the most successful experiences of economic growth in world history. Economic historians and economists wrote books about it. Khrushchev, you may remember, in the late 1950s, famously announced, "We will bury you." You know, everybody was fooled. The CIA was fooled, the Soviets were fooled, the Americans were fooled. World Nobel Prize-winning economists were fooled into thinking that what was going on in the Soviet Union represented some enormous change in the economic model. Okay? So the Chinese have done much better because they've actually moved to more inclusive institutions than the Soviets were ever able to do. But I think this version, this is interesting just to show how easy it is to be fooled by 10 or 20 or 30 years of economic growth. Okay, so our view about China is they don't have a model, they don't have the right political institutions to make economic growth sustainable. Okay, that's it. So, all right. So in the book, most of the book, we emphasize in some sense these two combinations. You know, there's poor countries, there's North Korea, there's South Korea. North Korea has this combination of extractive economic institutions underpinned by extractive political institutions. Prosperous countries have inclusive economic institutions underpinned by inclusive political institutions. So if you want to make poor countries rich, if you want to create economic development in countries that are poor, you have to make their institutions more inclusive. You have to create more inclusive political institutions. That's the thrust of the argument. You have to create a broader distribution of political power in society. You have to create state institutions which are more effective and more accountable and more transparent. So how do you do that? Okay. Well, obviously, my discussion suggests that's a very difficult thing to do. Most poor countries like North Korea or Zimbabwe are there because the system as it is suits the interests of people who exercise authority. So they're not going to create an inclusive society on a whim. So that means you need to have social change in order to create more inclusive political institutions. And let me just end by talking a little bit about that transition, okay? And if you thought about, what is this? This is William and Mary. This is William of Orange, who became King of England after the Glorious Revolution in 1688. This is the coronation. Somebody's bringing him the crown, okay? But think about the Arab Spring, if you like. What was the Arab Spring about? Well, you had a series of dictatorships. In Tunisia, President Ben Ali, President Mubarak; in Egypt, President Assad; in Syria. They were very extractive societies. You know, if you think about the Egyptian economy, for example, there was enormous concentration of economic power, monopolies, people connected to President Mubarak's son. There was an extractive set of economic institutions, and there were extractive political institutions. There was a one-party state run by President Mubarak, who was president for life. What happened with the Arab Spring? People who resented the extractive institutions tried to organize to make the society more inclusive. Of course, the example of the Arab Spring illustrates how difficult that is to create a more inclusive society. In the Egyptian case, Egypt is back to where it was before. It's now run by the military with a different military officer in control. In Tunisia, there's been a big change towards a more inclusive society, more democratic, more open, less corrupt, less extractive. In Syria, of course, the state collapsed, and there's this horrible civil war which has created so many problems for Turkey, not just for the people of Syria. So that shows you how difficult it is to transform extractive into inclusive institutions. So in our book, we talk about this process, and we kind of say, what is it? You know, what is it about a society that can lead from extractive to inclusive? Or what does it take for this type of collective action or contestation of the society? What does it take for that to lead to more inclusive institutions? And we emphasize what we call in the book the need for a broad coalition. Okay? So what's interesting about Tunisia compared to the other societies in the Middle East that experienced the Arab Spring is that Tunisian society is somehow much more diverse. There's a trade union movement. It's a much more pluralistic society. There's a much bigger middle class. It's much more educated than Egypt, for example. So I think what I would say is a difference between Tunisia and Egypt is that when this contestation took place, the people who were contesting were very different. In Tunisia, there was something much more like what we call a broad coalition of groups in society that was able to really mobilize to demand that institutions became more inclusive. Okay? But in the book, we discuss a lot how difficult it is to change extractive to inclusive institutions. You can see from my discussion that's not something that is inevitable, but nevertheless, you know, if you look around the world, you see many societies that have done that. So I'm not an expert on Turkey, and I couldn't possibly speak for the institutional challenges or the problems in Turkey, but Turkey seems to be a great example of a society which has become much more inclusive in the last 20 or 30 years. It's much more democratic, much more open, and you see here the incredible economic dynamism. I was just blown away last night when I came here to this part of Istanbul, which I'd never seen before, and just to listen this morning to all this kind of ambition about innovation and inclusiveness, and we're going to make this a financial hub, and that ambition, that's what it takes to become successful. And so I congratulate you on the institution building, the inclusive institution building that's going on right here and now. And people are going to ask me questions. I think I said what I have to say. So, thank you. How are we going to organize this?
Question and answer.
Okay.
Efendim, Sayın Robinson'a soru yöneltmek isteyen değerli konuklarımıza arkadaşlarımız yardımcı olacaklar. Hem ayağa kalkarlarsa salon, çünkü çok kalabalık. Mikrofonları değerli arkadaşlarımıza uzatmanızı rica edeceğim.
Channel 1, yes.
Hello. Hello, Mr. Robinson. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for your great book. And my question is, considering your examples in your book, like the Roman Empire and Venice, how they turned into extractive, institutions and eventually collapsed, and like British Empire, how they changed their extractive institutions to inclusive institutions in the end. What do you see the future of the world in general, or how do you see the technology affecting this? So do you see technology supporting dictatorships or autocratic nations, or do you see a more open future for the world?
I think what we emphasize in the book is that in inclusive societies, there's many feedbacks which tend to sustain inclusion. But nevertheless, as you're saying, there's many instances in history where inclusive societies become much more extractive. So I think that's always possible, because in any inclusive society, there's always an incentive for somebody to set up extractive institutions. And we give, these historical examples, as you're suggesting. I would say, though, my main sense is that if you look at the big picture of the last 100 years, the world has become much more inclusive than it has been historically. The world's much more democratic than it was historically. People are much better informed than they were historically. I mean, I work a lot in sub-Saharan Africa. I think it's more and more difficult to sustain the type of regime that President Mugabe has in Africa. There's more and more pressure on regimes like that. Nowadays, if you think about it, it's also very interesting. People have more sense of their rights. This language of rights, I think, has been very powerful. Think about the empowerment of women, for example, all over the world. So I think if you look around, you can see many aspects of inclusion spreading. So I don't think it's easy to, dramatically change these societies like Zimbabwe or North Korea or whatever. But I think the big picture is pretty optimistic. I think, on the other hand, as you're suggesting, there's many challenges to that. One of the things that keeps me up at night in the United States nowadays is the fact that the largest male occupation in the United States is driving. Bus drivers, taxi drivers, delivery drivers, those jobs are all going to disappear in the next 10 or 20 years because of self-driving vehicles. There's a huge amount of effort being put into self-driving vehicles. It's going to come. The technology is there. They just have to sort out the institutions, actually. They have to sort out the property rights and who's liable for damage and injury. So there's a sort of legal contracting problem to solve. But the technology's all there. That's going to create hundreds of thousands of unemployed people, people who are unskilled, who could vote for who knows what they would vote for. So I think that's something that you know, the political system has to be able to cope with. And, you know, but I do think, you know, in the book we give many, many examples of historical challenges like that. You know, go back to my talk when I talked about the robber barons and Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company. I think in the past, you know, inclusive political institutions that we've seen, for example, in the United States, have been good at dealing with this. But, you know, they face a big challenge at the moment. President Trump would like to undermine all sorts of aspects of what I would regard as aspects of inclusive political institutions, checks and balances, all sorts of things like that. So there's always challenges. You know, it's very hard to predict the future. I don't usually talk about that. But as I said, I do think, you know, at some level, one can be optimistic, but then, you know, we should never fall into this fallacy that, you know, this time it's different. You know, history can repeat itself in many ways, and I guess being in Turkey, you know, you see something very different. There's just so many problems in the region here that Turkey has to manage and deal with, and you know, you have enormous problems with refugees and political instability across the border. So you know, maybe people's perspective here is a little less optimistic about the world. But I do see things that are optimistic. But, you know, as you're saying, there's also a lot of challenges.
Mr. Robinson, thank you for your excellent talk and your historical perspective. My question is, in what sense do you think the societies of the golden age of Egypt some 3,400 years ago and golden age of Roman Empire some 1,900 years ago, which were both slave societies, in what sense do you regard them as inclusive?
Well, I don't think they were very inclusive. I mean, so, you know, part of the problem of using this sort of dichotomy between inclusive and extractive is that there's lots of gray areas, you know, like United States, for example. You know, the United States had 50% of the people in the south of the United States until 1865 were slaves as well. But that, you know, that fits the picture, it turns out, you know, because if you look at the US South, it was much poorer than the North. It had far less infrastructure, railways, canals. It had very little industry compared to the North. So the South had this very extractive economy, and it was relatively poor. I think the key thing about the United States is that the institutions of the United States got constructed before the slave economy took off, which was really in the first half of the 19th century, the cotton economy. You know, if the South had won the Civil War, the United States would be a completely different place, I think. So I think, you know, there's always gray areas. You know, if you go out of my office at the University of Chicago and you turn the wrong way, in 5 blocks you're in the South Side, which is the ghetto, where there's enormous social problems of gangs and drugs and lack of incentives and opportunities, particularly lack of opportunities. There's enormous cycle of the reproduction of poverty and exclusion. So I think there's, you know, I'm not here at all saying, you know, the United States is this perfect place. No, it isn't. There's all sorts of problems in the United States. There always have been, and there still are. So I think that my view of that would be true of Rome. You know, if you went back to Rome, yes, it's true in ancient Rome, you know, there was a lot of inclusivity for citizens, but there were slaves. There was an enormous amount of slavery, at least within Italy, working in the rural sector. So that was partially inclusive. And then it became much less inclusive, you know, after the fall of the Republic with the start of the empire, you know, with the abolition of basically these participatory political institutions for plebs and all of that. So it's sort of, I would say it was partially inclusive. It was inclusive enough to generate prosperity for hundreds of years relative to other places in the ancient world. But then it became more extractive. So I think, you know, ancient Egypt, I would never call inclusive at all. But, you know, even extractive societies are capable of, you know, building roads, providing some sorts of public goods which may be in the interests of the people running them, you know, maybe irrigation, generating agricultural productivity, and so ancient Egypt was able to generate some amount of prosperity, but I wouldn't call it inclusive at all.
Merhabalar, hoş geldiniz diyeyim ben öncelikle. Ben yeni mezun bir iktisat öğrencisiyim. Şöyle bir şeyden bahsettiniz. Biz okulda da sizin kitaplarınızı çok duyduk Acemoğlu Hoca ile birlikte. Şöyle bir şey merak ediyorum ben. Ekonomik büyümenin itici gücünün aslında kurumlar olduğunu savunuyorsunuz sanırım.
Is this working? It's on one? Sorry. I don't know. Try again.
Okay. Ben iktisat bölümünden yeni mezun bir öğrenciyim. Okulda da sizin kitaplarınızdan, isimlerinizden çok bahsedildi. Şöyle bir şey merak ediyorum. Genel olarak ekonomik büyümenin itici gücünün kurumlar olduğunu sanırım iddia ediyorsunuz zaten anladığım kadarıyla. Fakat mesela bence BRICS ülkeleri desek, işte Brezilya, Rusya, Endonezya, Çin, Güney Afrika gibi ülkeler. Bunlarda bu kapsayıcı kurumların ne kadar yetkin olduğunu bilmiyorum. Çok da olduğunu düşünmüyorum ama çok büyük büyüme oranlarını yakalayabildiler. Yükselen piyasalar dediğimiz noktalara geldiler. Yani peki bu ülkelerdeki bu itici güç nedir? Eğer kurumlar değillerse veya kurumlar mıdır tam olarak bilmiyorum ama oradaki ekonomik itici gücün ne olduğunu aslında size sormak istedim.
Yeah, I think those cases are very different. I think economic growth in Russia is based on natural resource prices, and that's it. So, you can sustain quite high levels of prosperity with extractive institutions if you have a lot of natural resource wealth. So I would say I wouldn't call Saudi Arabia, for example, that's not a very inclusive society, but it's quite a prosperous society because they have oil. So and Russia is a bit like that. But India, I'd say, is completely different. If you thought about India, it's actually a very interesting example of the theory. There's many extractive institutions in Indian society, like the caste system, for example, this hereditary model of, occupation and status and hierarchy. But why did the Indian economy start growing, in the 1990s? It started growing because economic institutions became much more inclusive. The business people stopped becoming enemies, and the Congress Party decided that business people might actually be useful for society. And so they started dismantling what was known as the License Raj, which is this immense system of government regulation which blocked incentives and opportunities for a private sector. So I think that in India, it's clear that, like China, economic growth started when economic institutions became more inclusive. Why did economic institutions in India become more inclusive? Because in the late 1970s, the Congress Party lost an election for the first time since 1948. Mrs. Gandhi lost an election. What did she do then? She made up with the business people. She realized she needed the business people. The country needed the business people, and they started dismantling all of those regulations. This actually happened before the famous opening under her son. So actually, I think that the story of inclusive political institutions stimulating inclusive economic institutions explains what's been going on in India very well. That being said, there's enormous problems, I would say, in India for having an inclusive society because so many of these social institutions, I didn't talk too much about social institutions, but the society in many ways is not inclusive at all in India. There's enormous impediments to opportunity and social mobility, and that's going to limit what India can achieve economically. I think Brazil, we talk a little bit about Brazil towards the end of the book, in particular about whether or not the transition from the military dictatorship which happened in the 1980s, which led to this rise of the Workers' Party, has represented a move to a more inclusive society. And I think, what we've learned in the last couple of years, though, is that that's probably not true. There's still enormous problems in the way the Brazilian state works. There's enormous problems of corruption and lack of transparency and proper procedures. And so I think Brazil still suffers from many of the problems of Latin American countries. You know, I was talking about Colombia, but Brazil is, you know, very similar in many ways. So I don't see, I think India is something very different, but I don't see in Brazil the necessary institutions to create a really prosperous society. So they do have innovation and success in some parts of the economy, in the aerospace industry, for example, but I don't see the basis for broad-based prosperity in Brazil. And you have enormous problems of criminality and violence and, and ghettos, the same way that we have in Chicago, but, it's on a different scale in Brazil. So, I think all these cases are different and interesting, but that's my take on that. South Africa, I could talk about that too, but maybe I spoke too much.
Efendim teşekkür ediyoruz. Süremizin
Okay.
sonuna geldik. Sayın Robinson'a da teşekkür ediyoruz. Please stay on the stage for present ceremony.
okay.
Sayın Robinson'a teşekkür ediyoruz ve katılım ve katkılarından dolayı kendilerine teşekkürlerini sunmak üzere Sermaye Piyasası Kurulu Başkanımız Doktor Sayın Vahdettin Ertaş'ı sahneye davet etmek istiyorum. Please, here you are. Efendim plaket geliyor. Buyurunuz lütfen gelin. Efendim salondan çıkmamanızı rica edeceğim. Anlayışınız için teşekkür ediyorum. Yaklaşık 1 dakika bana kulak kabartmanızı rica edeceğim. Anlayışınız için bir kez daha
Okay.
sağ olun.
Wonderful, thank you. Beautiful.
Efendim teşekkür ediyoruz. Saygıyla yerlerinize uğurlamak istiyoruz. We thank to Mr. Robinson for your speech and presentation again. Efendim, Sermaye Piyasaları Kongresi 2017 1 saatlik aranın ardından devam edecek ama sizlere bir hatırlatmada bulunmak istiyorum. Sayın Robinson'ın kitabı olan Ulusların Düşüşü, Güç, Zenginlik ve Yoksulluğun Kökenleri adlı kitap imza etkinliği olacak. Sayın Robinson'ın sunumundan önce de bahsettim sizlere. Hemen ana salondan çıkıyoruz. Hezarfen salonunda olacak. Görevli arkadaşlarımız sizleri yönlendirecek. Bir hatırlatma daha. Öğleden sonra bu büyük salon 3'e bölünecek. Burası A salonu olacak. Hemen ekranlarda da görüyorsunuz. A, B ve C salonları olacak. Eş paralel oturumlar düzenlenecek. Yine birbirinden değerli isimleri ağırlayacağız. Saatime bakıyorum, saat 12.30, saat 13.30'da yine burada görüşmek dileğiyle. Şimdilik hoşça kalın.